Hey y'all, this is chapter 8 on memory, and this chapter is really important because people often think that what they're going to learn in this class about like studying habits and things like that is in the learning chapter, but as we've just completed the learning chapter, you probably realize that that's not actually what learning is about. Learning is about associations, and memory is actually the chapter where you're going to learn some important study skills and ways to practice and rehearse for exams. So chapter 8 is really important, not just material-wise, but also in application to your real life. So let's go ahead and get started, and hopefully you come out of this a little bit stronger of a student, right? Okay, so the first thing to know in this chapter is the difference between recall and recognition. We'll come back to relearning. It's not really in the same group of being distinguished between as these two. So next to recall, I want you to write down fill in the blank. Next to recall, write down fill in the blank or short answer. Fill in the blank and short answer are measures of recall. Next to recognition, I want you to write down multiple choice. Recall, fill in the blank, short answer. Recognition, multiple choice. So the idea here is that recall memory is memory that you would have to pull information from your brain out in order to answer. So, with fill in the blank, there's no word bank, there's no choices. You're just expected to recall the information from your own brain, from your own memory. So recall is like fill in the blank or short answer. There's no prompt. They give you, a question prompt, but there's no memory cues that you're given. Another example of recall would be after you've witnessed a crime and then the officer is asking you questions about what happened and is asking you to recall details of a crime. That's another example of recall. Here's the question, but I'm not going to give you any prompting. I'm not going to lead you on to say some, one thing versus another. You have to pull the information out of your own brain. Whereas recognition, all of the information is there in front of you. You just have to recognize and pick the correct answer. So recognition is like a multiple choice test. And then relearning just really speaks to this principle that if you've already learned something in the past and then you go to relearn that material, you relearn it much more quickly than you learned it the first time. So relearning is just about how you save time, learning something a second time compared to the first time you learned it. It took much longer. Okay, so the way you should think of encoding, storage, and retrieval is encoding is just getting information into your brain. Storage is holding that information there in your brain, and then retrieval is like recall, pulling that information back out of your brain. So encoding, getting the information into your brain, storage, holding it there, retrieval, pulling it back out of your brain now. Remember in chapter 3, we talked about parallel processing. It's really just this idea that you can process many aspects of a problem simultaneously, and we will come back to that a little bit later as well. So these 4 types of memory. Remember, when things come in 4s, they make great test questions, right? So the first type of memory that we're interested in is sensory memory. And this is the most brief, fleeting of the memories. Sensory memory leaves your brain so quickly. But sensory memory is the immediate, brief recording of sensory information. So remembering exactly how something smelled or tasted or felt, that sort of thing is a sensory memory. And yes, to some degree, I can imagine, what it feels like to pet my cat, but it's just not the same thing as actually petting a cat, right? So that's the idea, is sensory memory. So that's the idea, that sensory memories are held in your brain, but just for a very brief period of time. Short-term memory is what it sounds like, activated memory that holds just a few items briefly, like if you need to remember a phone number just long enough to dial it, and then you essentially just throw that information away. We don't care about it anymore. It was short-term. It helped me complete the goal of whatever I needed to do in the moment, but now I don't need it anymore. We throw it away. And then long-term memory. Now, I think the key thing to remember about long-term memory, this is interesting, is that we actually have not discovered a limit to long-term memory. We call it limitless. So really, theoretically, if you try hard enough, you can remember anything. You can memorize anything. And there's no limit to how much you're able to memorize. And so long-term memory is this limitless storehouse of memory that we hold on to throughout our lives. And then working memory is the newest of these, in the sense that it's the newest term that we've come up with to describe a memory activity. But working memory is short-term memory that is for the purpose of achieving some goal. So it's kind of like if you're solving a math problem, right? And you have to remember to distribute and combine like terms and, isolate y and stuff like that. Well, you need to collect the information of the mathematical processes that you're doing along the way while you solve the problem. Because if you, distribute and then you throw that information away, right? And you no longer remember what you even just did in the last step, well, you're not going to be able to finish the task of doing the math problem. So working memory is just this idea that it's short-term memory that's applied towards completing a goal, and then you get rid of it. Same thing as short-term memory. So working memory is a little bit longer than short-term memory, but ultimately you then make the choice with your working memory to throw that information away and not address it again short-term, or move it over into your long-term storage. Keep practicing it, keep rehearsing it. Okay, so next to explicit memory on your worksheet, I should see this written down. Next to explicit memory, write down hippocampus. Your hippocampus is what functions in processing explicit memory. Hippocampus. Next to implicit memory, write down cerebellum and basal ganglia. Cerebellum and basal ganglia. Those are the two structures that are most influential in implicit memory. So explicit memory is also called declarative memory. That's just a memory of something that you can say out loud. Like, George Washington was the first president. That's an explicit memory. I know it. I can declare it. It's conscious. An implicit memory is something that you have memory of, but it's probably something that's relatively difficult to explain. Like, remembering how to ride a bike. Well, how accurately can I really describe what it's like to ride a bike, right? But I hop on a bike, my implicit memory kicks in, and I just start riding it. So implicit memory is something you really don't have to give a lot of conscious attention to. It's something that really is housed in your unconscious mind for the most part. When it comes to effortful versus automatic processing, these go right along with explicit and implicit memory. Effortful processing requires your conscious attention, so it goes along with explicit memory. The two E's go together. Explicit, effortful. Effortful, explicit. So when you're engaging in effortful processing, you're making some kind of effort to process the information that's presented to you. Versus automatic processing is something that you do not have to put conscious effort towards. Automatic processing happens all the time, right? Right now, even just watching this video, your brain is automatically processing a lot of information around you. Like what's going on in the room that you're in, or what information is, in front of you that you're reading, or what information you're hearing, right? So automatic processing is always going on. But when you direct your attention towards something and make a genuine effort to learn and remember stuff, that's effortful processing. So automatic goes with implicit memory, effortful goes with explicit memory. Iconic and echoic memory are just like they sound. An iconic memory is a memory of something visual, whereas echoic memory is a memory of something auditory. So like hearing, your professor having said something in class, for example, hearing them say it in your head, remembering how they said it, what they said, that would be an echoic memory. Whereas an iconic memory would be a memory of maybe some kind of picture, piece of art, or even just a scene that you saw. So iconic is visual, echoic is auditory. And also, echoic memory lasts for about 3 or 4 seconds. Now, you can encode things deeper, further than that, and, have echoic memories that do last longer than that. But just in general, as you're going about the course of your day, you remember things you just heard for about 3 or 4 seconds, and then you kind of lose what that information is, except for maybe kind of the overarching general idea of it. Whereas iconic memory only lasts a few tenths of a second. So that's like way, way less even than echoic. Okay. Chunking is this organization of items into smaller units. You chunk up the information into smaller, more manageable units. So this is why, actually, phone numbers are in groups of 3 numbers, and 4 numbers, instead of all just 10 numbers right along one after the other. We chunk, or we break up that information into more manageable units. An area code, a 3-digit, whatever, and then 4 digits at the end. And really, chunking is something we do all the time. How are all of your textbooks organized? Well, it's not just one big long text of information. It's chapter by chapter by chapter. We've chunked the information up into, a chunk of textbook about consciousness, and a chunk about memory, and a chunk about learning, and etc. Oh, and then mnemonics are anything that you use to try to aid your memory. So, making up a silly saying or a song or just anything that will help you to remember something. Usually these techniques are going to employ vivid imagery and organizational devices. When it comes to spacing and testing effect is what I've been talking about this whole semester, and this is part of the reason that I have you do these SI sessions the way I have you do them, where you first watch a video lecture and fill out a worksheet, and then we meet for a Zoom session, and then when it comes time for test review, I give you your test review materials in bits and pieces. Because the spacing effect is this idea that if you space out your studying or your practice of something, you actually end up with better long-term retention than if you cram for something. You tend to forget most of the information that you've crammed after just a short while. So cramming, may work for one exam, but when you get to the final, you're going to have a lot of work to do. So it's better off to just space out your study from the beginning so that when you get to the final, you actually already remember most of what you learned. And then the testing effect says that we have the best memory of things if we retrieve information, we recall information over and over, instead of just rereading information. And that's really just because of the neural pathways that are activated when you recall information. The more that you recall information, the stronger those neural pathways become, the more that you use them. And so if you're just rereading information, you're not strengthening those connections. You're just putting more information into your brain that you're essentially throwing away short term. But the testing effect, if you test yourself, if you retrieve, if you recall that information, then you're strengthening those neural circuits. Shallow processing is essentially whatever it is that you're trying to process, you're just taking it at face value and you're just trying to memorize it based on what it is. Versus deep processing, we're actually trying to assign meaning to what it is that we're trying to remember and process. So, if you just are trying to memorize, the word pencil, for example, if you're shallow processing, then you're just going to look at the word and try to put it in your brain and remember it. But if you're deep processing, you might come up with, some mnemonic, essentially, to help you remember that you need to remember this pencil, right? So you just have to assign meaning to it in any way. So maybe you picture, your greatest role model holding this pencil, or something along these lines. It doesn't matter really how you do it, but the idea is just that with deep processing, you're assigning meaning to what it is you're trying to remember instead of just trying to remember it for the sake of what it is. And deep processing leads to better retention than shallow processing. Okay, like I said, hippocampus and frontal lobes are what's involved in the explicit memory system. Hippocampus is for explicit memory. And then we kind of have these other terms, like semantic memory is explicit memory of facts and general knowledge, whereas episodic memory is like an episode. It's an explicit memory of an event that you experienced. And it's kind of played like a movie in your head a little bit. So like someone might have a very intense episodic memory of their wedding day, for example. They remember the episode, the event of walking down the aisle and getting married. And then memory consolidation is just when, and this mostly happens when we're in REM sleep, when your short-term memories that are in your hippocampus are moved over to long-term memory. That's called memory consolidation. Those short-term memories are being consolidated into long-term storage. And then the implicit memory system is the cerebellum and basal ganglia. The cerebellum is for implicit memories that are formed by classical conditioning. So, Pavlov's dog that began to associate the ringing of a bell with the presence of food. It's the cerebellum of the dog that learned that association. Another one is, we know that when we see lightning, we expect to hear thunder, or if we hear thunder, we expect to see lightning. That is an implicit memory that is stored in your cerebellum. It's a classical conditioning memory. So think cerebellum starts with a C, so does classical conditioning. Cerebellum is for classical conditioning, whereas the basal ganglia is for muscle memory. So the basal ganglia is all about coordinating this muscle or motor memory, remembering how to ride a bike, remembering how to do a dance, remembering those sorts of things you can't really explain. And, both of these implicit memories are things you can't really explain. You're not going to be able to explain a classical conditioning association that you've made because you're largely unaware that it's even there. But you also can't really explain muscle memory very well. I can't really explain how I know to just get on a bike and start riding it correctly. But nonetheless, that's a muscle memory that my basal ganglia has. And then flashbulb memories. These get asked about a lot, so definitely be aware of flashbulb memories. But a flashbulb memory is something that is a memory that is particularly emotionally significant. Flashbulb memories have to do with emotional significance, and they're housed in the amygdala, which is, of course, our sort of center for emotion, particularly fear and aggression. But the amygdala is involved in, several actions and feelings and stuff that have to do with emotion. The amygdala is very closely linked with emotion. So flashbulb memory of an emotionally significant moment or event, your wedding day, or, maybe on the other end of that, the day you found out you were diagnosed with cancer or something like that. It can be good or bad, but it just has to be emotionally significant, and that is housed in the amygdala as a flashbulb memory. Okay, now long-term potentiation is what I was just talking about when I said that, the more times that you practice material, the more strengthened those neural connections become. So when you recall information, you strengthen the neural connections for the recall of that information. And that's really what long-term potentiation is talking about. A cell's tendency to increase in firing potential after being stimulated repeatedly. So the more that we use a neural circuit, the more that we stimulate a neuron to fire, the easier it fires. Okay? So rapidly stimulating certain memory circuit connections increases their sensitivity, it lowers their threshold, and the sending neuron needs less prompting to release its neurotransmitter. That's the idea. Priming is this unconscious activation of associations in memory. And so one example that I think is really interesting is, if you bring people into a room and you give them, a lecture about rabbits, bunnies, versus other people who are given, a lecture on something completely unrelated, or maybe no lecture at all, whatever they've decided is the control group equivalent. But if you give people a lecture on bunnies and then you ask them to write the word hare, they are like so many times more likely to spell it H-A-R-E than the people who were in a lecture that had nothing to do with bunnies. They're more likely to spell it H-A-I-R. So priming is this unconscious activation of an association you are not aware of. No one's thinking, oh, I better write a hare, H-A-R-E, because we were just talking about rabbits. They're just telling you spell the word hare. They might give you a list of words to spell. And, when it comes to hare, that's the biggest difference that we see, is that the people who were listening to the lecture about bunnies write it down H-A-R-E, and all the other people who had a lecture about something different are writing it H-A-I-R. So, just kind of an interesting idea. Okay, the encoding specificity principle. What I want you to write down on your worksheet, what I should see written down on your worksheet here is, next to the encoding specificity principle, wherever we first learned information is where we will remember it the best, or remember it the easiest. Wherever we first learned information is where we will remember it best or easiest. Okay? So the encoding specificity principle says that our encoding, our ability to get information into our brain, is specific to the context and the environment that we're in. So really, wherever you're going to be taking your exam is exactly where you should be studying for that exam, because your recall is improved when you are in the same context, trying to recall the information as you were when you first learned it. State-dependent memory it goes along with the encoding specificity principle, and this just says what we learn in one mental state is more easily recalled when we're once again in that state. So, if you hide your keys while you're sober, then while you're drunk, you shouldn't remember where they are. But let's say you hid your keys while you were drunk, and now you're sober, you probably can't remember where you put them. So you might need to get drunk again in order to be able to remember it, because, that memory was state-dependent, for example. And then mood congruent memory is just another variation of the encoding specificity principle, the tendency to recall experiences that are consistent with your good or bad mood. So have you ever noticed that maybe when you're having a really good day, it's really easy to think of all of the positive things. It's really easy to think of all the happy things that are going on in your life. But when you're having a bad day, it's like all you can think of is the negative. That's because of mood congruent memory. You have a tendency to recall experiences that are consistent with the mood that you're currently in. And then the serial position effect is this idea that whatever information, like if given a list of information, whatever comes first and whatever comes last is more likely to be remembered than whatever was in the middle. And when it comes first, that's called the primacy effect. It was the primary, the first thing that you heard or learned. And then the last thing we call the recency effect, because it was the most recent item in the list that you heard. But the idea behind serial position effect is we remember the first and last items of a list better than any items in the middle. Okay. So, people always confuse anterograde and retrograde amnesia. So next to this, I should see this written down on your worksheet. Next to this, you should say, the first word tells you what you are forgetting or what you are failing to remember. The first word tells you what you are forgetting or what you are failing to remember. So with anterograde amnesia, you cannot form new memories. Antero means coming in the future, essentially. So anterograde amnesia, the first word tells you what you're failing to remember, failing to be able to form new memories of. And so anterograde amnesia is the inability to form new memories. Whereas retrograde, like retroactive, we're talking about stuff in the past, you know, even the style, the retro style was in the past, right? So retrograde amnesia, first word tells you what you're failing to remember. So this is an inability to retrieve information from the past, the inability to recall old memories. And in a little bit here, we'll also get to proactive and retroactive interference, and that goes hand in hand with this as well. So failure to encode is something that happens frequently. Failure to encode occurs when we see things over and over, but we don't ever consciously make an effort to remember them. So here's some good examples. Only 1 in 85 could accurately draw the Apple logo, even when every single participant in the sample had seen it multiple times or owned an Apple product themselves. We have a general idea of what the Apple logo is, but, you know, is the bite out of the apple on the right side? Is it on the left side? Which way does the leaf point? Who's to say, right? Because this is not something that we consciously make an effort to encode, despite the fact that we see it all the time. Another example is we have trouble remembering exactly what's on our nation's coins, you know? Where does it say, "In God we trust"? Where does it, you know, what's the year on the coin? Who's on each coin? Which way are they facing? The guy on the penny, is he facing to the right, facing to the left, right? We see these things all the time, but we fail to actually encode them, to put them into our brain for storage. And then we've got this forgetting curve. And so you see that within one day, you have lost about 70% of the information that you learned. Within 20 minutes, you're basically down 50%. But by the end of the day, 70% of what you learned is completely gone. So the point here is that things that you forget, or the course of forgetting, is very rapid at first. You have this huge drop in information that you've retained. But then after that, it plateaus and levels off. So what you remember, 6 days after you learned it is about the same amount you remember 31 days after you've learned it. Okay, so now here we are to proactive and retroactive interference. Now be aware that it is super frequent to see 4 answer choices on problems where the first 2 answer choices are anterograde amnesia and retrograde amnesia, and the second 2 answer choices are proactive interference and retroactive interference. So you want to be very aware of these 4 things and the differences between them. So again, I want you to write this down a second time. The first word tells you what you are forgetting or what you are failing to remember. Okay? So if it's proactive interference, we cannot recall new information because old information is getting in the way. Now, people get this very confused because they think proactive interference, well, proactive means something new. So it's something new that's interfering with old information. Not so. That is not the correct logic to be applying to this. Even though it seems to make some intuitive sense. The first word tells you what you are forgetting or failing to remember. So if it's proactive interference, I cannot remember the new information because old information is getting in the way. So this would be like if you change your phone number and all you can possibly remember is your old phone number. You can't remember the new one because the old phone number is getting in the way. It's interfering. That's proactive interference because I can't remember the new thing. I can't remember the new phone number, or I can't remember the new combination on my lock because all I can think of is the old combination. And then retroactive interference, the first word tells you what you're failing to remember. We are forgetting or failing to recall old information because new information is getting in the way. So this is sort of the opposite way around where, let's say that you hear a parody of a song, right? So someone's singing new lyrics to the tune of an old song, and then for the life of you, you just can't remember what the original words were because all you can hear in your mind is parody lyrics instead. So retroactive interference, I can't remember the old information because new information is getting in the way. You definitely want to be able to tell the difference between those 4 things: anterograde and retrograde amnesia, proactive and retroactive interference. And then there's this idea of motivated forgetting, and there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that this is really something that people participate in or that we should be all that concerned about. But repression was Freud's idea in his psychoanalytic theory that, information that makes us uncomfortable or anxious is information that we want to banish from our conscious awareness. We just want to totally push it away and forget all about it. And so the idea behind repression is that there are lots of memories that we have, but we just can't access because we've thrown them into the abyss of our unconscious mind to try to not deal with them because they're uncomfortable and anxiety-provoking. And so Freud thought that we self-censor information and we repress these painful or unacceptable memories to protect our self-concept and to minimize our anxiety. It's a defense mechanism in his mind. But of course, like I said, not a huge amount of evidence for it, but nonetheless, a theory that he had. Okay, reconsolidation. So remember when we talked about consolidating memories being the process of moving short-term memories into long-term memories? Well, reconsolidation is when you retrieve a memory, you change it a little bit, and then you store it again. So reconsolidation is really kind of an error, honestly. But I mean, think about it. How many times have you maybe told a story to a friend and you kind of forget a couple of the details, so you just make something up for the sake of, continuing your story, and maybe that, detail wasn't really that important anyway. Like, I don't remember how I got to the store, so I'll just say that I was, going there for a friend or something like that. Whatever, right? I'll say something to fill in the gap because it's not that important. But if you retrieve the memory, fill in those gaps, and then put it back in your mind, you're actually likely to misremember that memory, and whatever you had made up to fill in the gaps will become a part of that memory that you think actually truly did happen. Even if at first your intention wasn't to, change the memory for yourself or convince yourself that something happened when it didn't a certain way. But nonetheless, whatever you practice is what you remember. So and the more times you do it too, the more times you pull that memory out and fill in those gaps, the more altered that memory becomes. The misinformation effect occurs when misleading information has corrupted your memory of an event. So let's say that you heard a speaker and you thought that the speaker was great, right? You thought that they were actually pretty engaging, thought they were great. And then your friend comes along and says, I don't know why you liked that speaker so much. He is a racist, for example, right? They say something that changes your opinion now. And so now when you go back and you think about that memory of the speaker, you no longer are thinking, oh, that guy was a really good speaker. You're thinking, oh my gosh, he was a horrible speaker because he was a horrible person. So your memory of the event was corrupted by information that really had nothing to do with the event. And sometimes that information is misleading or it's misinformation. And sometimes it's just, it may still be accurate, but it's just changing the way that you remember something happening. So it's changing the way that you think about it. Source amnesia is simply just forgetting where you heard something. Like, I know, for example, that George Washington was the first president, but was it my first grade teacher that told me that? Was it my mom that told me that? Was it a friend? I mean, who's to say, right? I have source amnesia. I have no idea how, when, or where I learned that information, but I do know that I learned it somewhere. Deja vu, we've all experienced that. It's that sort of sense that like you've seen something or experienced something before. And it really just comes from cues from the current situation unconsciously triggering or priming you to retrieve an earlier experience. So deja vu is never truly that you've actually seen something before, but that you've seen something similar. Okay, discerning true and false memories. I think this is super interesting. So when we describe childhood experiences, we fill in gaps with reasonable guesses. And like I said, the more we repeat those guesses, the more we believe them to be true. Leading questions are something that can affect your memory of an event, right? So if someone, leads you to give a certain expected response, you may give that response. It may not be entirely accurate, but now you've encoded it into your mind as being the truth. We are more likely to recall having always felt how we feel currently, even if our attitudes have changed. So let's say that someone was a staunch Republican and now they have turned Democrat. Well, if they're going to recall how they felt years ago, they're actually going to recall feeling more progressive, more democratic than they truly were at the time, because we are more likely to recall having always felt the way that we currently feel, even if that was not the true case. And then there's one thing I want you to actually write down here on your worksheet. This will be the last thing for this worksheet. My mom actually always used to say this. So I want you to write down her quote, which is, "The worst lies you can tell are the ones you tell yourself." The worst lies you can tell are the ones you tell yourself. And that's just because, like I've been saying, if you fill in these gaps with reasonable guesses or not reasonable guesses, unreasonable ones, when you fill in gaps in your information and you reconsolidate those memories, you start to believe your own BS. So the more times you lie, the more you actually believe the lies that you're telling. And that's dangerous, not just for you, but for anyone else who comes into your life that you might affect. So the worst lies that you can tell are the ones you tell yourself. Truly changes the way that you think about and perceive many other things. Okay, last little bit here. Children's eyewitness recall. So children's memories can be easily molded and influenced, and this is largely because children have very active imaginations. And 58% of preschoolers produced false, often vivid stories about one or more events that they never experienced when prompted. So, if you ask, we brought in this sample of preschoolers, and we asked them, hey, can you tell me about that time that you went up into a hot air balloon with your family? And none of them had ever been in a hot air balloon before. But 58% of them were like, yeah, I can tell you all about it. I remember that, my family and I, we had all just gone to get ice cream right before it happened. And then, we got on this big balloon and we went up into the air. I mean, they will just come up with like a whole narrative. Even down to details like, as we were walking up to the balloon, my brother tripped and fell. Like, they will just produce the craziest stories of things that never even happened. So it's hard to trust things that really young children say. And professional psychologists could not reliably separate real memories from false memories in children. So, a third party knew whether or not a child was telling the truth and could confirm or deny. But we would bring in these professional psychologists and tell them, hey, they're either telling you the truth or a lie, figure it out. And they could not reliably separate true from false narratives or memories that children were giving. But the good news is, when you question children about their experiences in neutral words that they understand, they will often accurately recall things that happened in the past. So instead of saying, hey, tell me about the time you went on a hot air balloon ride with your family, you would just ask them, have you ever seen a hot air balloon? Have you ever been in one? Neutral words. You're not leading them to say something that they wouldn't otherwise be saying. And then this is really just kind of something for you guys to maybe read through and It's just kind of some tips, some study tips, essentially, on how to improve your memory. And so just the first one is rehearse repeatedly. So this is like the spacing effect and the testing effect. If you keep rehearsing information over and over again, you'll actually also achieve long-term potentiation in those neural networks that you use or that are activated when you recall information. Make the material meaningful. So this is about deep processing. You want to take notes in your own words and make as many associations as possible. So that's what I try to do by giving you guys a bunch of examples that you can apply to your real life so that you can assign some meaning to the material and then therefore engage yourself in deep processing. Activating retrieval cues. So context-dependent, state-dependent memory, you should recreate the situation and the mood in which your original learning occurred, because then you're able to most easily recall that information on an exam. Use mnemonic devices. So again, this is another kind of deep processing application. If you give your memories vivid images that help you remember them, chunking, acronyms and rhymes, stuff like that, that will help you to deeply process the information. Minimize proactive and retroactive interference. So you should not study topics back to back that can interfere with one another. So topics that are very similar, sociology and psychology, for example, you probably shouldn't study back to back. And then sleep more, because your brain consolidates information into your long-term memory while you sleep. So it's actually best to study right before bed, so those memories are fresh in your mind and can be transferred to long-term memory as you sleep. And then lastly, test your own knowledge, both to rehearse it and to find out what you don't yet know. That is the testing effect, and it is real and powerful. All right, that's all for this one. So be sure to submit that pre-session worksheet with those things highlighted or bolded or a different color or something like that. It makes it so much easier for me. So go ahead and submit that pre-session worksheet, and I will see you at the Zoom session.